Hello everybody, this is International Master Jesse Cry with the second installment on my series on the two minors versus the rook. Now in the first segment we talked about various positions arising from the opening and talked about the value of the two minors versus the rook in those positions. To summarize, I think what we found was that the two minors were stronger than a rook in the opening phase of the game. And so we'd have to then ask ourselves, well, what about other phases of the game? Is it always the case that the two minors will be so much stronger than a rook? And that's going to be the focus of today's lecture. And instead of looking at various examples, I'm going to take us through a very nice game between Raphael Vaganyan and Boris Spassky from Moscow in 1975, which I think illustrates a lot of the themes of bishop and knight versus rook. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the opening, but the opening was a classical Queen's Gambit declined and developed along fairly familiar lines. And this variation that Vaganyan is using is, at that time in 75, I think relatively new. And all kinds of variations of this plan where white takes on bishop on f6 and then tries to put pressure on d5 and hinder the advance c5. All kinds of variations of that idea are popular still today. Okay, so Spassky just plays slow, c6, and it looks kind of ridiculous because it looks like his structure has been compromised and this bishop on b7 is useless. But in fact, it's going to be very hard to break the black position down, and if the position opens up, his two bishops will be strong. Okay, castles 8, d1, knight d7, knight e1. Okay, so this is the beginning of an ambitious realignment of the white forces, where the white knight will come to d3, and what Vaganyan's dreaming of is someday to put his bishop on this diagonal, where it'll exert a strong influence. However, in hindsight, we might say that this plan is a little bit too slow, and I think it's just on the basis of this regrouping that maybe it's a little too slow that Spassky might have been able to gain an edge. Let's see what happens. Knight f8, knight d3, knight e6. Now, although I don't want to spend too much time on this, the idea of this regrouping is that this knight on e6 is actually very good in supporting c5, and once he gets to c5, he'll be putting more pressure on d4, which is really the crux square in the position. Okay, white plays rook e1, queen d6, and bishop f1. Okay, so here it's a little bit more evident what white's trying to do. He intends to play g3 and bishop g2. That's nice because the bishop on g2 will touch d5, and by touching d5 it'll make it harder for black to play c5 in turn. Also, by putting his pawns in dark squares, it's kind of nice because then his bishop can move nicely among them. Okay, so Spassky plays a very interesting move here that I'm just going to play and then talk a little bit about it. It's very deep on a variety of levels. So he plays rook e7. Then you can say to yourself, well, what is this about? In fact, it's not just about moving the rook to e8, which, although that might be prove useful a little later. The point is this. If Vaganyan now plays g3, then this square is weak. Okay, and what Spassky's planning is then bishop takes d4, pawn takes, knight takes, and then the knight will hit both the queen and that f3 square. So a fantastic bit of anticipation, realizing that white must play g3 in a lot of ways, or otherwise he's in a bit of strategical zugzwang. And what I mean by that is he doesn't really have any more useful move that he can actually play if he doesn't play g3. Okay, this is really looking like a football diagram. So I'm going to make a couple more moves here for white. But before I do, let's just ask ourselves, what do you think? Should white play g3 anyway? It looks like black would then get 2 pawns and a rook in exchange for 2 minors. And already we'd have to wonder, because in the opening phase of the game, we saw that that was usually a mistake for the person with the 2 minors to give them up. It might seem especially ridiculous because the black knight went from b8 to d7 to f8 to e6, and so if we trade him off, we trade off all of those tempos that we've invested in. So, if you want to hit the pause button, that would be a good exercise. And make it an exercise. Should white play g3? In fact, white did. Maybe a mistake. But in order to see that, I think we'll have to look a little bit more at the position that then results. Now, you can ask yourself, what does this whole thing with rook e7 have to do with the tactic on f3? Well, the point is, it's very delicate, is that bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes. Now, there's a subtle difference. If the black rook were on e8, okay, then white could now play rook takes e8 check. Okay. As it is, however, he can't. The best he could do is maybe something like rook takes e7, knight takes b3, rook takes b7, but then something like knight a5, and the rook is gone. So that's not possible. So, what's happened here is now black is going to get a rook and 2 pawns for 2 minors. Let's look at the position. Queen a4, knight f3, king h1. All these moves seem relatively forced. Knight takes rook, knight takes knight. And this would have to be the kind of position we'd have to foresee in order to make a judgment as to whether bishop takes d4 was a good move. I think the answer is yes, that this was a very good decision by black. Now, why would I say that here and then not in the opening examples that we looked at in our last segment? There's some key differences here. The main one, I think, is that the white minor pieces are disorganized. They're not mobilized yet. The next thing to notice is that since we took away the center pawns, black really owns the center with his pawns, and because he owns the center, white won't be able to place any of his minor pieces in any kind of central locations or outposts from which they could really show themselves to be valuable pieces. And without that, it's going to be hard for the minor pieces really to be effective. If they can't be in the center, it's also not apparent where they could attack black, because black really has no weaknesses. Okay, so that's from a negative point of view from white. But I think the very interesting and aesthetically pleasing thing about this game, from my point of view for black, is that not only that, I think, but the factor of this coordination, but I think black has a long-range strategy that we see play out in this game. What black does in this game, and I think it's very laudable strategy here, is that what he would like to do is basically trade off everything, okay, except the rook versus the 2 minor pieces. So we're not even going to try to win anything, and it's hard to imagine how we would, because white doesn't really have any severe weaknesses either. He just has discoordinated pieces. But what we're envisioning is our rook reaching some sort of position where it's penetrated into the white camp, and white's 2 minor pieces will be ineffective in terms of mobilizing against us in any kind of effective manner. If we do that, it might appear, as it does in this game, that the rook could even be better than the 2 minor pieces. And that's a very hard thing to imagine, but I think this game gives us some reason to believe that in some cases, especially in the case where the game is open and there's less pieces on the board, the rook can be better than the 2 minor pieces. So that's the beautiful long-range strategy that we're going to see at work in this game. Black wants to exchange pieces, and it's going to be hard for white to stop him because of his own present discoordination, which black is going to try to keep up. Okay, so first of all, d4. Again, we're discoordinating opponent's pieces. He can't take the pawn on d4 because of c5 and the discovered check. So, white plays knight g2. So he stops the threat, but also the knight really isn't doing anything on g2. c5, knight b1. Rook a e8, king g1. a6. Very nice. We're just now going to slowly improve our position. Knight d2, b5, queen a3. Notice that our central control is really shoving all of the white pieces back, even the queen. Queen d5. And now, it's interesting because I think a lot of players here would think to themselves, well, black's winning because he's got some kind of tactical mate. Well, in fact, that's just not the case. We'll see that white can parry the mate, but the bigger threat that black has now is that it's going to be impossible for white to stop him from trading this rook off. And that's going to be key, because if we trade off the counterpart to black's rook, then we'll be able to penetrate with our rook into his position. And again, if the more pieces we trade, at least that's what I'm proposing, the more pieces we trade, the easier it'll be for our rooks to dominate the two minor pieces. b3, rook e1. Rook e1, rook e1. And now white has to make this weakness with f3. Now, I guess what you can call a combination now ensues, and it's very beautiful because this combination does not aim at necessarily winning material, but it really aims at trading off more pieces. Let's take a look. Rook d1. We cannot move the knight on d2, so queen b2 looks forced. Queen g5. The point of this is that now the knight has to come up to f4, and we can shuffle back to e5, where we're now threatening queen e3 check. So now the knight has to give up his position. Knight e4, f5. Now the white queen really can't attack the white rook with like queen c2, because we could then just play rook takes bishop and pawn takes knight. So the knight has to go back to f2. Only moves. All these moves, as far as I can tell, are more or less forced. And now, very nice idea, queen e3. So we pin the knight, but I think a lot of people wouldn't even think about this kind of plan, because now white plays knight g2, and it looks like now that black's attack is just coming to an end. But in fact, this is exactly what black has played for. Rook d2. And what he's done is he's forced the exchange of queens. Knight takes queen, rook takes. Well, let's take a look at the position for a moment. So, in terms of material, nothing's changed. But what I'd like us to notice is just that the strength of the rook has magnified extraordinarily. He's on the 7th now, and he does a number of things there. He's obviously going to start harassing the white pawn, and if he takes both of those pawns off, obviously black will be in a position to run with his outside passed pawns. But he's also, and this is very important, he's cutting the white king from effectively advancing to take part in the game. The black king, on the other hand, is ready to come off. So this rook is doing an incredible job already, getting ready to hack the pawns and creating a situation where the black king is going to be way more effective than the white king. And remember, the king is just kind of like a minor piece in terms of its strength. You could assign it a role of 3, or in endgame some people even say 3.5. So if we have basically an extra piece, then really we're not down material at all. technically, in this position. Let's look at how the game progressed. Knight takes f5, rook takes a2. I really think that with every pawn that's taken, the strength of the rook increases. Knight d3. Spassky's just patient. Rook c2. b4. So Vaganyan starts complications, but really all that's happening is we're trading more things. Pawn takes. Knight takes. Rook d2. Knight d3. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop d5. So it's interesting, we're just trading off more things, and it's all, I think, part of Spassky's design here, his long-term strategical plan. Knight f5, bishop e4, knight e7, king f7, knight c5, king takes, knight takes. We trade off another piece. Rook b2, we're not in a hurry. Knight c3. And now I think Vaganyan played his best move of the game. Realizing that he'd been completely outplayed, he did not wait for his opponent's move, and he resigned, which gives the game a sort of poetic justice to the whole thing. Why did he resign? It's kind of rare to resign in such a position, because when you think about it, he's been down the 2 pawns for the rook and 2 minors forever. It's been like a long series of moves. But the situation has changed drastically now. Black has all the time in the world now to advance to the queen side to help the pawns advance, whereas his counterpart on g1 can do nothing. Notice also that the 2 minor pieces still have no effective outpost in the center where they can exert some kind of influence. It's kind of as if they don't have a grounding. Right? They're like it's a house without a grounding or a foundation. They're just kind of pushed along in the wind without a foundation where they can exert some influence. Whereas the rook is just a beast in terms of its ability to snatch pawns and to keep the opponent's king at bay. So very nice game, one of my favorites, and I think it's very nice in terms of the rook versus the 2 minors, because what you see is a flow, beginning with this nice move, rook e7, which is in itself a prophylactic move. And what I mean by that was rook e7 was designed to stop white's plan of g3. Even though white did it anyway, it might have been a mistake. And that thinking of stopping your opponent from doing what he wants to do is a key part of prophylactic thought. And the idea really is that if you're stopping your opponent from doing what he wants to do, it's not merely a defensive action. It's in fact a very aggressive thing to do, because your opponent is then stifled. And this game, I think, is a nice example of that as well. So, just to summarize, from rook e7 to this point, we see a flow, a continuous flow. And if you imagine on a graph, take in mind our lectures from the first segment. If you imagine on the graph, in the first segment, the bishop and knight were much stronger than the rook. But the more we progressed towards the endgame, as we saw in this example, where we moved from the middle game to the endgame, the more we progressed to the endgame, the stronger the rook became. This is International Master Jesse Cry, hoping you've enjoyed the sublime play of Boris Spassky, Moscow 1975, against one of my heroes, Raphael Vaganyan.